When you were growing up, who was your first hero? Now, for me, my first hero was someone that many of you have heard of before, someone very famous that I'm sure that's locked into your brain. And she goes by the name Mommy. Yes, my mother was my first hero, and more specifically, my first diversity inclusion hero, and she's actually here today. Mom, if you mind giving a round of applause. Thank you so much. Now, growing up in Grand Rapids, Michigan, my mom at that time was a single mom with two rambunctious little boys, right? And early on, we didn't have a lot of money. And so we would go to Salvation Army before it became cool. And we went and she would buy like little sweater vests and bow ties because I swear she was trying to create a boys and men group. But the interesting thing is that even though we didn't have a lot early on, had some economic challenges, my mom still made sure that we went out to experience diversity. So we went to Oktoberfest, we went to Polish festivals, Hispanic Heritage Month events, and a host of other events. But we didn't just go out to experience diversity. We actually also brought it into our home. And we had exchange students from France and Japan and from Brazil and 2 from Germany. And I remember asking my mom as I started working on my book, The Inclusive Mindset, and started asking like, Mom, where in the world did you get this perspective? See, my mom was one of the first black female air traffic controllers in the Air Force. And she shared that there would be times when she was stationed in Japan for 2 years, that there were some soldiers in that same time frame, in that 2 years, that never left base. And she said, Justin, I never wanted you and your brother to grow up and never leave your home base, to experience the world and beauty around you. And I started thinking about all the things that my mom taught me and all the things that I learned. And she actually inspired me in 20 years of work, of diversity and equity and inclusion work, and 10 years of speaking and consulting with organizations. And I started trying to really hone in on this growth-focused, heart-based approach to diversity and inclusion. And I realized my mindset came from my mom. Who was your first hero? And as I think about all the things that my mom taught me and that I learned along this journey, I realized that I've made a lot of mistakes. I've made a lot of assumptions about people. Right? I've made a mess of this thing called diversity and inclusion. And I want to let you know that you are not alone. And even though I've made a mess and mistakes, I'm still learning, I'm still growing, and I'm still making progress. And today, I want to help you to make meaningful progress, to not make so many assumptions about people, but to embrace and experience the beauty of the world around you. But what are assumptions anyway? Well, assumptions can be defined as unexamined beliefs. And I realize as people are leaving their home bases that a fundamental problem is occurring, and it can be summed up by Anais Nin, the French-Cuban-American novelist, who states, "We don't see things as they are. We see things as we are." We don't get to know people when we make assumptions. We get to know our version of them. And that's what I call taking the exit. And when we take the exit on people, we take the exit on powerful possibilities. So what does it mean to take the exit? Now, taking the exit happens at times when we have incomplete information about people, right? Like something happens that impacts us negatively, and we know for certain, 100,000%, that that person absolutely meant the worst. We also take the exit when we stop asking questions and stop challenging what we know. It's almost like that colleague at work, the annoying one that you've been staying away from, and they always challenge every single idea you have, and you've been convinced that they actually have a personal vendetta against you. That's what it means to take the exit. But let's look at it another way. Have you ever had the privilege of driving? And Monday through Friday, you take this exit. Monday through Friday, you take the exit. And then one day you're supposed to go straight, but what do? Take the exit. Why? Because our brains are wired that way. Our brains want to conserve energy for things it doesn't know. And so our brains move into this place called default mode or mental autopilot, where it takes the exit. And that's the same thing that happens with people right before we get to know someone, right before we understand who they are. We end up taking the exit on second and third-hand information. But how do we challenge this notion of taking the exit in our brains? Well, I love the brain research. And there's an amazing person by the name of Daniel Kahneman who wrote a book and has research called Thinking Fast and Slow. And I realized something powerful in this, that in order for us to actually build bridges and open doors, that the intentionality of how we think matters. And Daniel Kahneman speaks to this in System 1 and System 2 thinking. And System 1 thinking, it's something that requires a little effort. It's not really conscious. I can just do it almost in my sleep. It's almost like if I asked you to answer this. Now, what's the answer? There we go. It was pretty easy once you thought about it, right? They're like, is that a trick question? But System 2 thinking is thinking that requires a more conscious effort. It's more deliberate. It takes a little bit more time. And that's like answering this. You don't have to answer that. And y'all, oftentimes in our System 1 thinking, our default mode, that's when we're taking the exit. Because taking the exit is easy. It requires little effort. We move on second and third-hand information, perceptions, media. See, because our brains are actually wired in that conserving energy, what it does is that what we think about and what we know is based upon our world and what we know of it. But let's put our brains into action. And if we're honest today, all of us take the exit at some times, don't we? Now, there's some diversity and inclusion folks that would tell you only stuff that they've already gotten over. Let me share with you something that I currently still struggle with. Anytime I see a black woman who's in a relationship with a white man, my automatic reaction is, oh, there's not enough good brothers for you? Now, I know that to be false, and I know people can love who they want to love, and I know that to be so true that I have several black women friends who are in relationships with white men. My business manager, Dari, is a black woman who's married to Derek, a white man. But just because I know that to be true doesn't erase the years of conditioning that I received from some members of my community, some in my extended family, and certain people in my neighborhood. And y'all, that's where we've gotten diversity and inclusion a little bit wrong. Just because we had the thought, just because we took the exit, we feel such shame and guilt. But that's not the bigger issue. The bigger issue is, what do we do with it once we know we did? How do we in the future challenge our taking the exit and begin to drive forward? Now, I began to do this thing called mental framing, or what psychologists would call reframing. And I start becoming the romance novelist of all times. So I see a black woman, white man, and my automatic reaction, conditioned response comes in, oh, there's not enough good brothers for you? And then I go into that mode and I'm like, but they were probably walking alongside the river. And they looked into each other's eyes and they said, when I see your smile, just want to look at you. And rose petals were probably falling from the sky. All right, and I create these fictitious stories and I start chuckling to myself, right? Like, all right, challenging my brain. But I realized something pivotal, that it wasn't enough to create fictional stories, and that I actually needed to hear the stories of real people. And so I realized in that moment, I had never even asked Dari how she and Derek met. And as I heard their story, it was so powerful and it hit my heart. But we often don't hear other people's stories, do we? And there's several reasons for that. One of the reasons we don't hear people's stories is because, well, we might disagree with them or their difference, right? And that is another place where I feel like we've diverted in diversity and inclusion, where we've made it a kumbaya experience where we sing, kumbaya, diversity, where it's a hand-holding exercise, but that's not real diversity. Real diversity is not that we'll always agree, but it's that we'll always respect each other. Real diversity is that I can honor your humanity, and I believe this to be so true, is that I can vehemently disagree with your ideology and yet still passionately pursue your humanity if I first seek to be more interested than interesting. That's a part of our journey. Is how can we hear people's stories? How can we respectfully disagree with people? How do we consistently develop and learn about people? But often we don't hear people's stories. And you know why we don't hear people's stories? It's because we're afraid that things are going to be unpleasant. That we're not always going to jive with them. And really, honest with you, sometimes it's because we're me-centered. Have you ever done that? Have you ever been talking with someone and you were thinking, a person that you disagreed with, and you were thinking the entire time all of the ways that you will debunk every single viewpoint that they made? Right? It's what I call double Dutch communication. Oh, you don't know what double Dutch is? Oh, let me explain. All right, so a single rope is like this. Double Dutch is two ropes like this. And somebody waiting to jump in like this. And then they finally jump in and they're like, that's double Dutch, all right? But that's often how we communicate. We're waiting to jump in, like, take a breath, take a breath, take a breath, take a breath, and this is why I disagree with you. And we often communicate with this double Dutch style of communication where we're not hearing the perspectives and stories of others. But I hear you. You're saying, well, Justin, but not everyone is worth that effort. But in order to not make so many assumptions and to not jump in, we have to seek to be more interested than interesting. I've heard so many people tell me in my audience, they're like, Justin, I didn't take the exit on some people, and they actually proved to be exactly what I initially assumed. I get it, right? I've crashed and burned with many people as well. But the thing I've learned along this journey, it's not if we crash and burn. It's how do we learn and grow when we do. You see, taking the exit on people or not taking the exit, it's not primarily about them. It's about us developing a consistent habit of how we choose to show up in the world. That's what taking the exit is. It's not about every individual interaction that you have. It's about showing up in a unique way that impacts this journey. But will you go to that next soccer practice and see that annoying parent that's always yelling at the referees? And would you not take the exit on them? Will you go to your office, your Zoom call, your place of work, and that annoying coworker that has that stance and belief that you've chosen to stay away from? Will you engage your neighbor that has that sign in their yard that you don't like? That's not taking the exit on people. And that, my friends, is how we show up. And I get it. You're saying, Justin, that sounds all good, but how do we actually live this out? So I want to give you 2 practical ways to live this journey out. All right? First is called the Circles of Grace Challenge, and the second is math. Yes, math. The first, the Circles of Grace Challenge. All right? In the Circles of Grace Challenge, one of the interesting things is that many years ago, I created the Circles of Grace Challenge for myself to learn and grow. So every 6 months, I go to events, experiences, and I engage with people in either which I disagree or I don't know a lot about. And I go asking two questions. First, what can I learn about these events, experiences, and our people? And second, what can I learn about myself? And in my own journey, I realized that just because we take a Circles of Grace challenge doesn't mean that we'll always agree with what we learn. I've left many experiences not agreeing, but I always learn something new about them and myself. Now, some of you may say, Justin, not taking an exit on every person would be overwhelming. And I agree. We can't not take the exit on every person. And that's why I created this mathematical formula to help you. And this mathematical formula simply is this. And this is the only math you'll have to do again in this presentation. And it's a formula called 1 MC/W, which stands for one meaningful connection per week. What if you built into your calendar, even if just 15 to 20 minutes, time where you would have a meaningful connection with someone in your neighborhood, in your business, in your educational institution, and you learned about them. You had meaningful conversation. You learned about them. You asked them about them. You sought to be more interested and not interesting. Now, some of you, I heard, you're like, one meaningful connection per week, that's a lot. Well, let's flip the W upside down. One meaningful connection per month. Because this focus is all about progress and not perfection. So will you choose to not take the exit on others? Will you choose to symbolically ride along and learn about others, hear their stories, ask them about them? Then, and only then, I believe this place, this world, will be a place that my mother envisioned. A place where we don't have to take so many assumptions about people, where we can leave our home bases and engage the beauty of the world around us. A place I'd be happy to leave to my amazing children, Lydia and Peter. Daddy loves you, whoever you are. A place where the next generation isn't defined by their divisiveness, but rather by the deliberate depth of the relationships. So I hope that as you enter the highway of humanity, that you wouldn't take the exit on people. And instead, you drive forward towards some really amazing humans. And who knows? You might look up and notice some people looking at you as a really dope hero.